Okay, this video is a book review, and the name of the book is Calcium Connection by Brunde Broady. She's a lady who was in the finance industry, and her son was very sick. He had what seemed like some variation of a chronic fatigue syndrome since birth. She was wealthy, pretty smart lady. She hired a bunch of scientists to figure out what was wrong with her kid. And it came up with the child having extreme sensitivity to things that inhibit the Circa calcium pump in the brain. So this is Circa, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. I know that's a big fancy word, and this is a big fancy slide. I'm just showing you this in the beginning because there's going to be something magnificent that comes out of this lecture. There's going to be an academic orgasm, an AO. I just show you this slide to get a sense of the complexity of it. It's actually going to all totally make sense. And here's the big thing. I'll tell you the big secret right from the beginning. What I've been doing is trying to understand what causes brain cells to die, go into apoptosis, programmed cell death, recycling. And what I'm realizing is that the major patterns of neuronal cell death, they're all variations of the same thing, like a Bach fugue. And so it isn't just excitotoxicity. It isn't just mitochondrial injury. It isn't just Circa injury. Each one of these things causes the other two problems. So you can view them as all being interconnected. And we'll talk about what calcium does. Calcium is the on-off switch of a light inside of a cell. So if you have increased cytoplasm calcium in a neuron, it'll cause neurotransmitter to be released. For example, glutamate in this case. GLU is the abbreviation for glutamate. It's the most common neurotransmitter in the brain. About 75% of brain neurotransmitters are glutamate. And it's excitatory, meaning that it causes excitation, increased activity in the postsynaptic neuron. In the pineal cells of the brain, increased cytoplasm calcium causes melatonin to be secreted, which helps you to sleep. That's a good thing. Melatonin is also a powerful antioxidant. In the mast cells of the immune system, increased cytoplasm calcium causes them to degranulate, to release histamine, okay? And that causes a lot of inflammation, as well as some other inflammatory cytokines. In the pancreas, increased cytoplasm calcium causes the pancreatic beta cells to release insulin. So that's a key point. When cytoplasm calcium levels go up, the cells will secrete whatever they secrete. Okay. In addition, for muscle cells, like skeletal muscle cells, calcium going up inside the cytoplasm will cause the cell to contract. In heart muscle cells, it'll cause the initial pacemaker cell to beat, but it'll also cause heart muscle to contract. In the vascular smooth muscle cells that surround the arteries, increased cytoplasm calcium will cause those arteries to contract, and if it's abnormally prolonged elevated, they'll stay contracted, which also is called constricted, vasoconstricted, and that will cause hypertension because you're pumping blood through a narrowed vascular system. Okay, so that's what calcium does. And the old joke is like, the movie The Lord of the Rings, one ring to control them all. This is one ion, one electrolyte to control them all. Calcium is what makes things happen. Now, the baseline manual labor of the plasma cell membrane is done by potassium and by sodium. The K is for kalium, which is the Latin way of saying potassium, and the Na for sodium means natrium. It's a Latin way of saying sodium. Okay, and then ATP, adenosine triphosphate, gives up a phosphate to provide energy for the potassium sodium ATPase. And what that does is it pumps a lot of sodium outside of a cell. This is just any cell in the human body here. And they all use a potassium sodium ATPase to maintain an ion gradient. So an ion gradient means a charge gradient across the plasma membrane. So it's more negative inside. Like a typical cytoplasmic electrical potential would be negative 65 millivolts. And the reason to have that electrical gradient is that it can be used to perform work. It's like having a battery. When the circuit's closed, you can perform work. It also is dependent on what are called chemical gradients. There's a lot more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. So sodium in the extracellular matrix, it wants to come into the cell, both because it's attracted to the negative charge inside the cell, because sodium is a positively charged ion, it's Na+. Positively charged ions are called cations. Negatively charged ions would be called anions. But anyways, a positively charged ion is going to be attracted to this negative charge inside the cell. Once you've got these gradients built up, a gradient of concentration for sodium and a charge gradient, then you can couple the movement of sodium to other things. So when you want to pump calcium out of the cell, this electrochemical gradient of sodium can be coupled to it. So you allow some sodium to come in that case. And then that energy of spinning this pump will then pop out the calcium to pump it into the extracellular matrix. So this is called active transport because it uses ATP. This is called secondary active transport because it does not need ATP directly, but its ability to work with this sodium gradient is based on what this pump had generated. Okay, calcium normally is much higher, 15,000 times higher outside the cell than it is inside the cell. So its concentration outside the cell is 1.5 millimolar. Its concentration inside the cell under normal conditions, resting conditions, are about 100 nanomolar. Okay, once this goes up tenfold, so you're dealing with, let's say, 1,000 nanomolar concentration of calcium, which is about the same as 1 micromolar, then all these things will happen. Okay, now this right here is called the NACA exchanger, and that means NACA is NACA, sodium calcium exchanger. It's usually abbreviated NCX, and it's very fast. It can pump out 2,000 calcium ions per second. But it's low affinity, meaning that it only works when there's very high concentrations of calcium in the cell. So something like a neuron, an excitable cell that fires action potentials, it's going to need to have a NACA exchanger. But a lot of other cells, they just can work with a much slower pump. This is a plasma membrane calcium ATPase, PMCA. So for most routine cells, that's good enough. And this is high affinity, so it titrates very specifically low concentrations of intracytoplasmic calcium. Okay, in a neuron where you're firing one action potential after another, you have to be able to very quickly turn things on and off. Now here's the exciting thing in this talk. We were building up. I've talked a lot about potassium and sodium and even a good amount of calcium in the past, but what's unique for this lecture is I'm going to talk much more about Circa. So in the skeletal muscle, this is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In other cells, it's called the ER, endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum is in continuity with the cell's nucleus, where the DNA it is. Its outer part of its membrane, it's 2 leaflets, is in continuity with the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, and again, it's called sarcoplasmic reticulum in muscle cells, but the endoplasmic reticulum is a storage site for calcium. Most of that calcium is actually bound to binding proteins like calsequestrin. They abbreviate it CSQ. There's other binding proteins as well for calcium within the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so after the cell does whatever activity it normally does, let's say you're in a neuron and it releases a neurotransmitter, then the extra calcium, a lot of it is either pumped out of the cell into the extracellular matrix, that means outside the cell, or it is pumped into the endoplasmic reticulum. And you need to be able to turn things on and off real quick, like you'd flick a light switch on and off so that the cell can fire again. So anyways, this has tremendous significance for humans, for cognitive function, and for all these other related health and disease conditions. And we're going to go into all this in more detail here. I just wanted to introduce you to this slide because this is the money. There's a lot of knowledge here. Okay, this is very useful knowledge. It's going to have practical application, and I can pretty much guarantee you your doctor doesn't know this. This is really advanced sort of brain physiology, and it relates to the entire body as well. So what does Circa do? One ion to rule them all. Calcium turns things on and off. About 80% of the membrane protein in the sarcoplasmic reticulum of muscle cells is this Circa. Okay, so it's important. In a skeletal muscle, about 40% of the calories that muscle will burn are for Circa. When Circa function is decreased, all kinds of bad things happen in cells. So again, what does Circa do? In a muscle cell, it contracts, and the pineal gland releases melatonin, and the pancreas releases insulin. Okay, mast cells degranulates. Also in platelets, it causes increased aggregation, makes them clot. That's bad. So basically, all these things that are going to decrease Circa function, they're going to make platelets more prone to clotting, which is bad. And we also know excessive dietary sodium makes platelets more prone to clotting. That's bad. Psychological stress, bad. Okay, you don't want that. All right. And sort of one fundamental point I've made many times is that the old school way of looking at things is just, This is actually one spot where I'm going to go beyond Dr. McDougall. You know, he always says, it's the food. Dr. Clapper, it's the food. And you're going to hear a lot of the people in the nutrition world, the vegan world say, it's the food. Yes, the food is super important. I agree, it's the most important thing. But what I'm saying is the amount of toxins people are exposed to keeps going up, up, up and getting worse and worse. And I've seen lots of people tell me, I'm following the diet, I just can't lose the weight. And I'm following the diet, I just can't fully turn the corner. And what I'm saying is, you really should be studying these toxins because they're very, very common and they do have major effects, and most of them are very easy to avoid, so you can dramatically improve your health. And so I think the whole vegan community has missed the boat on toxins. They're pretty easy to learn. You just simply have to be aware they exist and just, start learning them. It's like memorizing anything else, and it's pretty easy to do, just knowing what you got to study. Okay, and again, I typically will call it the KNATPase. Some people will say the sodium first, then the potassium. I like to say the potassium first because I like to usually say whatever goes into the cell, I like to say that first. So to formalize the nomenclature, if you will. So Kn, potassium, sodium, ATP. So K as in K first coming into the cell, N as in Na, sodium going out of the cell. Okay, knockout exchanger, the Na first, Na coming into the cell, sodium, and Ca, calcium being pumped out. Okay. Now here's a neuron in the brain, and the first neuron is called the presynaptic neuron. The one across the synaptic cleft is called the postsynaptic neuron. Here is the cell body. These are mitochondria in the cell body. This is the cell nucleus where the DNA is located. Here's the axon hillock where it's thought that the action potential is initiated. The axon potential is going to jump over these myelinated areas to what are called the nodes of Ranvier to speed up the conduction. It's called saltatory conduction. Anyways, once the conduction reaches the synaptic terminal, the axon terminal, calcium is going to come in to the cytoplasm here. When calcium concentration gets high, it's going to cause these NTs, neurotransmitter vesicles, to merge with this plasma membrane here at the synapse, and then it's going to release this neurotransmitter, which diffuses across the cleft and activates the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so here's just what we talked about in more detail. Here's the sodium channels. They'll depolarize a neuron, causing an action potential to fire, which is an electrical impulse, which is conducted like a wire along this axon till it reaches the end part of the neuron called the synaptic terminal or the axon terminal. That causes opening of calcium channels. They allow calcium to come in. Raised cytoplasmic concentration of calcium causes this neurotransmitter vesicle to fuse, and it will release its neurotransmitter to travel across the synaptic cleft and activate the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, now here's just showing a regular cell and all the work done from the electrochemical gradient of sodium that has been established. The KNATPase is always pumping in 2 potassiums and 3 sodiums out. And the relevance of this is you're pumping out more positive charge than you're bringing in. That helps create this negative membrane gradient, meaning that you're more negative inside the cell than outside the cell. That's why I got all these negative charges here, positive charges outside the cell. For a neuron, 2/3 of its energy, so you can call that 66%, is dedicated to this pump. There's tons of these pumps. I know I show like one copy of everything on this plasma membrane, but there's going to be a lot more of these KNATPases, okay, than these other things in general. Okay, this is also why, from a dietary point of view, our ancestors probably ate at least 20 times as much potassium as sodium, and our cells are made to run on that. When people eat a lot of, like in the modern SAD diet, they're eating 10 times as much sodium as potassium. That'll dissipate these gradients. You'll start accumulating sodium inside the cell, and you're having a hard time maintaining these gradients the way you should, and the cell, becomes less able to function like it's supposed to. So it's real important to eat your, P for plants, P for potassium. You also get the magnesium from the plants. Oh, and by the way, the point of that cell, going back to it, was, I'm going to go back once, go to the previous, and because what I wanted to say was, all this work in the cell, this is the battery, it's the electrical energy of the cell. That's how it pumps its amino acids in and out of the cell. That's how it brings them in. That's how it also pumps out protons. It does tons of work based on this electrochemical gradient. There's a very good reason why the neurons use 2/3 of their energy for it. Okay. All right, so now we're getting up to the big fancy sun. So this is the same diagram as before, but I added all this detail now about how elevated cytoplasm calcium, when it goes from 100 nanomolar up to 1,000 nanomolar, so tenfold increase, whatever that cell does for a living, it gets activated, okay? And then as soon as it wants to shut off what it's doing, it'll pump these calciums out through the NACA exchanger into the extracellular matrix, meaning outside the cell, or it'll pump the calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum via the Circa pump. Sarcoplasm, as in skeletal muscle, sarcoplasmic, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase, because it uses ATP. That's why it's called an ATPase. And there's lots of things that'll lower Circa, and that's why Circa ends up being such a big deal, because tons of things will lower it. Now, I also briefly want to talk about mitochondria. So mitochondria is where the vast majority of energy is made inside a cell. Let's say 80%, more than 80% of the cell's energy. Here is the outer mitochondrial membrane. Here's the inner mitochondrial membrane. These are the electron transport complexes: complex 1, complex 2, complex 3, complex 4. And then here's coenzyme Q, which also transports electrons. Here's cytochrome C, which contributes to the electron transport chain. This one is called ATP synthase. Here is oxygen, the ultimate electron acceptor. So as electrons are passed from one carrier to the other, like a fireman bucket brigade, from this will be the least powerful grabbing of electrons to the most powerful grabbing of electrons at oxygen, the so-called ultimate electron acceptor. It then gets converted into water, H2O. At each of these complexes, a proton is pumped out. H plus right here is a proton, hydrogen with a plus there. It's electron absent. And then you built up a gradient of protons. That's called a proton gradient. And then the energy from harvesting that, allowing a proton to come back into the cell, is used to make an ATP. And that's how most energy for any animal on Earth, that's how it's made. All right, and this is how it normally works. All right, so I just want you to see what normal is, because in a moment I'm going to show you a whole bunch of things that inhibit it. Oh, by the way, just, people think, oh, a little bit of junk food, it's harmless, give a child some candy. No, it's a big deal. These food dyes, lots of them, not just one or two of them, lots of them all inhibit mitochondria. They're toxic, they're poisons. They're not just a waste of calories, they're poisons. Okay, so here's what I want to show you. These are all the things, that slide from a moment ago. This is basically the same slide, the inner mitochondrial membrane and the electron transport complexes. Look at all the things that inhibit it. This is mercury, Hg. TCE is trichloroethylene. That's like for dry cleaning fluid. So you don't want to, I don't take my clothes to dry cleaner anymore because I don't want this crap put on my clothes. Liquid paper can have some of this. Degreasing chemicals. A lot of cleaning chemicals are also quite toxic in and of themselves. Look at this, propofol, which is a commonly used anesthetic. It's also toxic to your mitochondria, complex 2. That's another reason why, I don't even go for colonoscopy anymore, but when I did go, I refused sedation. And it would be with the benzodiazepine probably, something like Versed or something, but I still wouldn't want it. That can affect your memory too. I don't want any of that stuff. A lot of these antifungal drugs will inhibit the same thing, complex 2, succinate dehydrogenase on the inner mitochondrial membrane. It's also part of the Krebs cycle within the mitochondrial matrix. It's sort of part of both pathways. Titanium dioxide nanoparticles, which is common in sunscreens, that also is toxic to electron transport here. Glyphosate, GP, that's toxic to complex 2. This is what I mean by people are getting nickel and dimed into dementia and death. And this is why I won't eat non-organic food, because I don't want this glyphosate stuff. It's especially sprayed on soy, but it's also sprayed on other things. Non-organic beans, it'll be sprayed on them. Non-organic oats, it gets sprayed on them. Cadmium is an important part of brake pads on automobiles. That's another reason why, I wouldn't sit at a sidewalk cafe next to a busy street. I don't want to be inhaling that stuff. Statin medications have a negative effect on coenzyme Q right here. Tylenol, a lot of people think Tylenol is no big deal, acetaminophen. Well, it has a negative effect on complex 3 of electron transport. I don't want any part of it. People have asked me, do I want to do welding or something? And I mean, it's a good skill to know, but ventilate the area well, and I don't do it because I'm always trying to protect my brain. It's toxic to complex 3. Lead is toxic to cytochrome C and ATP synthase. F- fluoride in the water is toxic to complex 4. Hydroxynonenal is a toxic aldehyde byproduct of omega-6 oils. That's why I never ever eat one drop of oil, because you start pushing towards lipid peroxidation. Excessive iron in the body leads to ferrous redox cycling, where you're producing more free radicals like a hydroxyl radical here. And that's the reason why you want to avoid iron and keep your serum ferritin lower. Oxidative stress can do a lot of damage to your mitochondria, your mitochondrial DNA and whatnot. Some of these anti-seizure and AEDs, anti-epilepsy drugs, can be toxic to mitochondria. Some of these bactericidal antibiotics, the ones that actually kill things, can be toxic to your mitochondria. Look at quinolones, and just remember, they're typically fluoroquinolones. When you put a fluoride on something, you make it more readily able to cross the blood-brain barrier, also to cross the blood-testes barrier. And so those are common antibiotics, those fluoroquinolones. And look at this, they're double freaking toxic. They're toxic to the mitochondria from the F-, toxic to mitochondria from the quinolone. Beta-lactam antibiotics, those are also toxic. Aminoglycosides, they're also toxic to the mitochondria. I don't want those things. I mean, sometimes you have to take an antibiotic, but man, you don't want to be doing it unless you have a good reason. Okay, excessive amounts of transitional metals like copper, they can all cause problems with your mitochondria. Iron, zinc, aluminum. Multiple food dyes are toxic to your mitochondria, like we just spoke about a minute ago. So there's a lot of things. This is kind of scary. And one of the things that was an academic orgasm AO here was mitochondrial inhibitors cause decreased ATP production. When you decrease your ATP production, then you don't have ATP available to run your potassium, sodium, ATP as plasma membrane pumps. Then you can't establish a good membrane electrochemical gradient of sodium. So then you can't run your knockout exchange, or NCX, or your plasma membrane calcium ATPase. So you're screwed. That means your cytoplasm calcium is going to go up, and you're going to get all those activities happening when you don't want them to, including excitotoxicity. You also can't run Circa because it's a calcium ATPase. It needs ATP to run to pump calcium into your endoplasmic reticulum. And so when that doesn't work, you get increased cytoplasm calcium. Increased cytoplasm calcium is going to cause increased glutamate release, that neurotransmitter, meaning you're going to have increased excitotoxicity, means abnormal increased activity in the postsynaptic neuron. So you see this? You're screwed either way. You're screwed for the mitochondrial inhibitors. You're screwed if you can't make this energy. And if you're screwed if you're doing things that inhibit Circa. I'm going to go through all the things that inhibit Circa in just a moment here. And all of them feed back on each other. There's a vicious cycle. Okay, it's the highway to hell. It's the highway to neuronal death, apoptosis. So you don't want to mess around with this stuff, I got lots of people my age, doctors, PhDs, and I'll talk to them and they're like, oh, I just can't concentrate. Oh, I just can't concentrate. Oh, I just have no energy. And I'm like, well, why don't you do this? Avoid these mitochondrial inhibitors, avoid these Circa inhibitors, avoid this. And like, oh, you're become a low-fat, low-sodium vegan. They're like, oh, you're so obsessive compulsive, you're so autistic. And I'm like, look, I don't have any of these problems. I'm just about 60 years of age, okay? Maybe if you, got off your lazy, ignorant butt, you would be able to have success with these things. This is not that complicated, but you have to do the work to get the benefit. Okay, come on. Show you a couple papers real quick. Diabetes increases formation of AGEs, advanced glycation end products, on sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. That's Circa. Okay, so diabetes will also get itself into a vicious cycle with reduced Circa function. And so, again, this is what I'm saying. You want to fix things before they become irreversible. Eventually, that'll destroy your beta cells, and you won't be able to make insulin, and the person will become insulin dependent in their diabetes. The same things that are estrogenic are quite often Circa inhibitors. Okay, so bisphenol A, here it is in a brominated flame retardant. For example, if I have to do, if I was doing a surgical case in the operating room, I would wear a blue gown. But most of the time, I'm doing something like a biopsy where I don't have to wear a blue gown. The blue gowns have flame retardants on them because they're for working with cautery where there might be a fire, okay? But if you don't have to put on these flame retardant things, then don't wear them. Don't get them on your furniture or your clothes. And look what it contains, bisphenol A. That's our classic, phenol A's are estrogenics. BPA, remember all the plastics. And it inhibits Circa, okay? And it's also got a halogen in there, bromine. Bromine is very common in flame retardants. So avoid these things as much as you can. All right, here's the titanium dioxide nanoparticles, and they're toxic to your sperm. They're toxic to Circa, and they're toxic to your sperm. And look at this. They inhibit succinate dehydrogenase, like I was saying a moment ago. They're a mitochondrial inhibitor. Okay, so these are very common in sunscreens, nanoparticles. It's a nanoparticle. You don't want any nanoparticles in your sunscreen, okay? Now look at this, neurotoxical effects. Titanium dioxide is toxic to your brain. It's also bad for the plasma membrane calcium ATPase. And it also inhibits nitric oxide synthase. This is a disaster, okay? And it has a toxic effect on several different neurotransmitters, okay? It does cause increased glutamine, so it probably has an excitotoxicity effect. I didn't have time to look that up, but I would expect that it does. because I don't wear sunscreen. I just, stand outside for, half hour, an hour on a sunny day, get my sun. That's all I need. I don't want to sit at the beach, rub all that junk on myself. No way. Okay, pineal calcification. Pineal calcification is increased with exposed to fluoride in the water. There's something interesting about it. They think that there's a problem with the Circa. So things that injure Circa are thought to increase cytoplasm calcification in the pineal gland, and that's thought to accelerate the rate at which it calcifies. And that's going to then, when it's calcified extensively, you're going to produce less melatonin, and you're not going to be able to sleep as well. So that is an overall toxic effect on a person's health. Okay, something else that was interesting is that things that decrease Circa, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase, the thing that pumps calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum, they're associated with increased cancer. So here's an example where they're associated with increased lung cancer when it's an adeno subtype or small cell lung cancer subtypes. And adenocarcinoma has become a lot more common in the last couple of decades. So it's also more common with other types of cancer, more common with lung cancer, with breast cancer, with colon cancer. In a moment here, I'm going to go through some of the ways to avoid it. Okay, what are some of the other problems? Things that are associated with lowered Circa levels. When Circa is not functioning as well as it should, you're more fat. The higher your BMI, the fatter the person is, probably the lower their Circa is. The worse their sleep apnea, the worse their Circa. The higher LDL cholesterol, the lower the Circa. The higher the hemoglobin A1C, the lower the Circa. So things that in general are bad for your metabolism, they also end up being associated with decreased Circa function, okay? Some people ask me, well, if my cholesterol is a little high, but I'm following the diet, am I probably okay? Yeah, and Drs. Ornish and Esselstyn have said that, yeah, in general, the people would follow the diet. Some people have a higher set point on their total cholesterol, but if they're truly following the diet, they usually end up having good long-term outcomes as far as atherosclerosis is concerned. But I've told you too, I'm coming from a different angle than McDougall, Ornish, and Esselstyn. The main thing they focus on, success is if you keep the coronary arteries open. My attitude is success is if you keep optimal brain function, cognitive function. The brain's fussier than the heart. So we got to go through all this other stuff if you really want the best odds. Okay, lots of these heavy metals end up being toxic to Circa. Lead, PB for plumbing, because they used it for plumbing in Rome. That's where it gets that name. Hg for mercury for measuring things. All these things inhibit Circa in the brain. Aluminum, cadmium. These are ways you can avoid them by avoiding these things. Food preservatives, they're super common. You don't want to eat this processed food. BHA, BHT, TBHQ, and there's other ones. They all decrease Circa function. Even the stuff in bread, the weird chemicals they put in bread like potassium bromate. Bromate, then, think of those halogens. The halogens in general are toxic to Circa. Food dyes, we talked about some of those, like red number 3 is a classic Circa inhibitor, but the other ones are mitochondrial inhibitors, which is going to cycle back around through that vicious cycle I showed you, and it's also going to be toxic to Circa and cause all the same problems and increase the risk of neuronal cell death. Miscellaneous things like benzopyrene from grilling meat, of course, that's bad. But, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, also tend to be harmful to Circa. You have a nose for a reason. If your nose tells you that something is bad or unpleasant, you should avoid it, okay? Any of these paints, anything that rapidly transitions from liquid to solid in general is harmful to you. It's going to give off volatile organic compounds. So that would be things like liquid paints that become solid, glues, adhesives, liquid adhesives. Okay, air fresheners. You don't want those stuff. I had a lady relative who was having asthma and stuff, and they got rid of the air fresheners in their house, and she improved a lot. House dust can be bad. It's good to have a HEPA filter in your house. It's good to, wet mop your floors, whatever, once every 2 weeks at least. Halogens, they're all the halogens tend to be pretty toxic. F minus, chloride, even iodine in its own way, bromine. All right, so, a lot of people tell me, oh, I'm going to have my kids swim. Swimming is such a great sport. I don't really think so. Like I said, when I was at Stanford, I never met a swimmer who I thought was smart. I think they sit all day long there and swimming in that pool, inhaling all that chlorine and that fluoride. I think it kind of lowers their IQs. Non-stick coatings on cookware. Yeah, that can leak fluoride into your food. Same thing as some of these dental floss. If it's Smooth Glide dental floss, one of those brands where it's coated with something, you don't want to use it. It might seem so nice that it gets between your teeth better, but it can harm you. You'll be ingesting fluoride and toxic stuff that's toxic to Circa, and Fluoride's toxic in a whole bunch of ways. We talked about cleaning chemicals. Don't take your stuff to a dry cleaner. It's a bad idea. It's not worth it. In general, any type of cleaners, powerful cleaner is probably going to be toxic. Stain removers, disinfectants. So sometimes you got to use those things, but keep it to a minimum. So-called recreational drugs are all toxic to Circa. Alcohol, tobacco, MJ, cocaine, they all are. And a lot of things that will cross the blood-brain barrier, they're also going to cross the blood-testicle barrier, the blood-ovary barrier, the blood-eye barrier. So they're often, the same thing quite often will be toxic to the brain, the testicles, the ovaries, and the eyeballs. So that's all bad. Psychological stress, the catecholamines will decrease Circa function. Estrogenic chemicals, lots of them are toxic to Circa. That's another reason to avoid those artificial exogenous estrogenic chemicals. We talked about those. I gave a bunch of lectures on that. Nanoparticle things like titanium dioxide in sunscreen. It's a whitener in paints, cosmetics, foods, medications. It not only makes you stupid, causing cognitive impairment, it's toxic to your sperm, to your balls in multiple ways. Zinc oxide is also toxic when it's a nanoparticle. Remember, these are nanoparticle forms of titanium dioxide, not just regular titanium dioxide, not just regular zinc oxide. When it's a nanoparticle, it becomes toxic to your Circa. Oxybenzone, another chemical in sunscreen, it has a negative effect on Circa. So you can see each one of these things might have a small effect by itself, but they all add up. And that's why, in the end, the smart move is to become a minimalist. And that's why I say, be like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing. You don't need all this crap. And don't be taking meds all the time. I know a lot of people are they think, oh, modern, better living through chemistry. And they love, take the latest pill. Match yield to the pill, send a pill. It's just stupid. You seldom need these pills. I mean, there are times when you have a focal infection and you really need a pill, okay? But you don't want to make a habit out of it. Be careful with these anti-malarials. I won't even travel to a place with high risk of malaria because I've seen so many people have bad complications from the so-called preventive medications being neurotoxic. I wouldn't take that chance. Okay, so what are some problems associated with decreased Circa levels? We talked about it. It'll push you into diabetes because it messes with your insulin production. Depletion of the endoplasmic reticulum calcium levels can lead to what's called endoplasmic reticulum stress, misfolding of the insulin, and it can progress towards the cell's apoptosis and eventual loss of insulin production from the pancreas. Mitochondrial injury, we talk about how all these things circle back upon each other. Mitochondrial injuries are related to Circa dysfunction, are related to excitotoxicity, okay? Excitotoxicity will destroy mitochondria. Severe Circa damage will lead to increased calcium in the cytoplasm, and the mitochondria will start to store more calcium until it fails. So they all cause each other, and they all, in severe cases, are disastrous for the cell. They cause the cell to die, go into apoptosis. When the heart has a problem with Circa, it's predisposed to congestive heart failure, and that can happen even if it's not necessarily all ischemia. This is a mechanism in addition to ischemia, lack of blood flow. It increases the risk of atrial fibrillation. So somebody with AFib, they would be wise to avoid all these things. I actually recommend the book, Calcium Connection by Brunde Broady. She had a couple scientists help her write the book. She didn't write the whole book by herself. She's not a doctor. She's a real nice lady, bright lady. She has videos on YouTube. The main thing she'll talk about is how your hemoglobin A1C and obesity and your LDL cholesterol all correlate with your Circa. So you don't have to specifically pay for an expensive way to test your Circa. You can just gauge it in general by those things and by avoiding all the things associated with decreased Circa function. You can do that all for free. I went through the book pretty extensively. I knew I had to get this done today because I had a busy day. So I just sat down. Whenever you want to get a lot of work done, just first thing in the morning, don't do anything else. Don't eat breakfast. Don't take a shower. Sit down and crank it out. And you'd be amazed how much work you can do when you do it that way. No cell phone in the room. No distractions. Don't look at your email. Just focus on the intellectual job starting early. And you'll be amazed at what you can crank out. Okay, increased risk of cataracts, excitotoxicity, cell apoptosis, decreased cognitive function, becoming stupid. I mean, most of the diabetics I talk to, their cognitive function is quite poor. They're pleasant, kind of like a cow. Hi, yes, it's sad. Okay, immune system. It makes your mast cells more prone to degranulate excessively, causing increased allergies, exaggerated systemic inflammation, more bowel problems, irritable bowel, more arthritis. Okay, it's just another one of these causes of systemic inflammation. You know, a meat and processed food diet also causes systemic inflammation for multiple other ways. Okay, increased cancer, we talked about that, and multiple different types. These are things that increase Circa function. Getting your exercise, getting your sleep, things that protect nitric oxide. Nitric oxide will increase Circa in your, let's say, your vascular smooth muscle, so it has a protective effect. Getting your sunshine, eating your plants to get your potassium and magnesium, avoiding dietary sodium, managing your stress so your catecholamine levels don't get too high. Avoiding unnecessary stress. And it's also true that, you know, a little bit of stress can be good. You need some stress to energize you, to be excited about something. That's all good. To do productive academic work, to lift weights, get yourself into the Yerkes Dachshund optimal performance zone. We talked about that before. Some stress is part of being a high achiever. So you want that. You just don't want excessive amounts, unnecessary stress. Magnesium is beneficial because it blocks the NMDA channel. It's the postsynaptic receptor for glutamate in the brain. So it helps prevent excitotoxicity, excessive elevation of calcium in the postsynaptic neuron in the cytoplasm. High K factor just means eat a lot more potassium than sodium, which happens automatically if you eat plant foods. Thyroid hormone itself will increase Circa a little bit. Insulin secretion, we're not going to talk about that too much. Just know that anything that inhibits Circa is bad for that. Store operated calcium. There's more stuff we could talk about, but these other things, they're sort of interesting, but they're not really going to affect you. You don't need to know this other stuff. Okay, that's all I got for today in this talk. In the future, I'll make a long, more detailed lecture on calcium signaling because it's kind of interesting. But what you need to know is avoid those things that increase Circa. All that thing I gave you the list there, and that'll help protect your brain health and your health overall. So anyways, hope that was interesting.